episode of the Critical Social Worker, a revolutionary storytelling podcast. I am here, very blessed to be joined here this morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at, with Brother KD, Kyle Toon. What's up? How are you this morning or afternoon?
I'm blessed and I am so grateful to be here. I'm happy. I'm healthy. My family's happy and healthy. And I'm so glad that you and I are able to take what we did on the Revolutionary Social Work podcast and bring it here to your students on the Critical Social Worker. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I always feel fortunate to be having a conversation with you. I'm just making sure that this is working up here on LinkedIn. So just give me a second. It says it's connecting. See if it goes. Oh, yeah, we're up on LinkedIn. Just gonna check Instagram and then we'll pop forward over here. Go live. And if you're in the audience, thanks for joining us. Feel free to chime in any questions you have in the chat or request to call in at any time. And I'm just gonna fix our layout here, Brother KD, because on Instagram it will just show the middle of us.
Okay.
So there we go. So it should show who's ever talking larger. What's up, David? What's up, Renee? What's up, Alice? Good to have you here. Um, Anyways,
Peace
back
and
to it here with
blessings, y'all.
Brother KD, and we were having a conversation just the other day that I thought we could continue on here, and I think it's that's relevant to the students because you're going to have to go through the history of social work, whether that's an intro to social work or going through policy history and things like that. And where do they always start us, Brother KD, when we're talking about social work history?
Yeah, right on. Definitely. One thing that I brought to your attention was the fact of how confused I was when I'm in my community and organization social work class, my first year, and Jane Addams and company was brought into the mix of being the pioneers and the innovators of social work. Um, to me, I thought that was not at the time without even having additional information. I just knew that that didn't seem right, especially since I grew up in the black church and I always knew that social welfare, social well-being, social programs has always been a part of the black church even before the Emancipation Proclamation 1865. So yeah, that was something that when I was in class, I it was a head scratcher.
Yeah, well, it's funny because my wife Alicia got into a little, I don't know, animated discussion on LinkedIn the other day about professional social workers and how if you don't have the degree or the licensure, then you're not a social worker. And on one hand, I can see that perspective that you attain this professionalism and you want to make sure that you know that you are recognized for that and you don't want other people claiming to have gone through the work that you went on. You know, kind of like what do they call it? The stolen valor in the military to some degree.
Yeah.
Um, but on the other hand, the word social work is a large word. You know what I'm saying? That should it should encompass a large variety of behaviors and service and acts. Um, and when I think about social work, and if we're thinking about the history of social work, well, people would have had to have been doing social work since the beginning of time. And so I think it's a problem when we're reducing it to just a professional. And I would say, if I was to respond to somebody who said they're a licensed clinical social worker in LCSW, I would say, well, okay, you're a social worker with a license in clinical social work, and this person is just maybe doing something different, some different kind of social work. But I think looking at another side of that is looking at from an African perspective or from an indigenous perspective, and did social work really start then? Where is there nobody that um, you know what I'm saying has been practicing social work in all those areas and all the annals of history?
You know, brother Ace, you bring a good point and a good argument into the mix because, professionalization of the discipline of social work, that's kind of where we're at now. And that's where your students are. That's where I'm at. You're obviously a in the academia space and the community space. And so there's that argument out here about how does social work keeps its the merit of professionalism, the banner, the approval by all other social science disciplines and healthcare and medicine, etc. And I think that when you really look at the roots and you really honor the roots and history of social work, you'll realize just how social work has always been integrated in anthropology within human civilization. There was always this, ancient Egypt really shows that in all their different kingdoms and empires that they had, that social welfare, social well-being, social development, social change, social action, all those, components of what makes social work potent, important, relevant to today has always been carried on by, in antiquity, all even before the licensing in 1980s, the push for licensing in 1980s, it's always been there. So why dishonor that and deserve that for the, due to the fact that licensing is, definitely provides privilege to those who decide to be in those clinical spaces. Um, but we have to honor that. If we're going to sit here and we're going to learn history and we're going to and we're going to sit there and we're creating an identity that is going to be long lasting and a steward of humanity, then we need to keep it real and we need to be very honest about the roots.
Yeah. So where would you say folks need to be looking? Because if say that a lot of it's out of people's control. If you're a student, you don't always control who your professor is or what um, what you're taught. And I think we do a really good job at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, but we're often limited by what we think we're confined to in a textbook, for example. Where would you
Mhm.
suggest for folks to go outside of that?
I would say because of the privilege of being in higher education, you have such a robust library system. I would say, and you can use these literal terms to go into your library system and to search for scholarly articles. Afrocentric paradigm, and what the Afrocentric paradigm will illuminate is the indigenous roots to healing, helping, service, community. And it really pulls from the philosophy of African traditional society, their conception of reality, their conception of human nature, human relations. And once you start to really see just how um, ancient and relevant to modern society that is, it will show you very vividly that social welfare, social change, social development, all of that, and even I would even say the onset to clinical social work because a lot of healing and the healing of the mind, healing of the spirit was done in ancient Egypt as well. A lot of that would be illuminated as well. So just search that in your library system, Afrocentric paradigm, and you'll find some articles. There's one particular by Ama Mazama. She's one of the greatest scholars when it comes to the Afrocentric paradigm, Afrocentric scholarship. So yeah, use that use that good old library system that you have, and you'll uncover some really great, valuable information.
In your experience, have you seen any Afrocentric thought or theory or anything at all in any of the social work courses you've taken or been a part of?
To answer that question very clearly and concisely, Professor Ace, no. So what I had to do, and this is about knowing thyself. So for all the students, go. I don't know where you all are in your social work education journey, first year, second year, in your practicum, not in your practicum just yet. Um, but it's very, very important to understand what your identity and your self concept is. Okay, so that's numero uno. That's the fundamentals. Bringing in the NASW code of ethics and the ethical standards and the values and all of that, vital important to the maintenance and integrity of the profession. However, you need to know yours coming into it, because that right there guides what your purpose, your promise, your destiny is. For me, I'm an African man. I'm an African man living in America. So therefore the thrust of my professional identity and the way in which that I show up professionally, intellectually, creatively is going to be for the survival, the maintenance, and advancement of African people. And so I think that that's very important to really sift and sort, do some self-reflection, self-discovery in order to find that your self-identity, your self-concept outside of the social work profession.
And how about you, Brother KD, on your when you look at your life and your history, maybe we can learn a little bit about you as well. Um, did you always have this awareness, or is it something that you built along the way, something you encountered?
Yeah, I've always been a curious soul. Even when I was a child, I grew up in the black church. However, I questioned the Bible every step of the way. None of my questions were answered. Um, but I've always been very, very inquisitive about mythology and human nature, human relations, and the contradictions between a black church being in a community where there's poverty, addiction, and all these other very negative, oppressive conditions, and you don't really see the church solving those problems. So when I was 9, 10 years old, I used to question that all the time. Um, I also went into the military, and I was in the military for 14 years, and I experienced complete indoctrination. I was brainwashed. I was programmed to think, believe, feel, and do anything in alignment to military strategy, objectives, goals, values, ethos. And when you go through something as indoctrinating as the military industrial complex, it you don't really realize just how brainwashed and um, how much unthinking and unconscious thinking that you do up until you reach the point that point of crystallization where you're just like, okay, I am starting to really see myself outside of the boots and the uniform and the infrastructure, and I'm starting to see other alternative ways of thinking, knowing, being, and doing. And so it really started, brother, Professor Ace. It really started when I was in the military, about I want to say around 2014. That's when I came to a point to where I realized just how, when you are part of very indoctrinating systems that require your full unconscious socialization, um, that I knew that I had to reconstruct myself. And so when I came into the social work program, 2023, I've already I already went through the reconstruction and the dismantling and the unlearning of everything, of every notion, every idea, every concept that I thought to be true. And so when I came in, I had that very confident African consciousness, African center consciousness, and I knew exactly that I wanted to work in spaces for the liberation and healing of African people.
Yeah. So you went. So after you got out of the military, that's when you went back to school and got an MSW.
Yes. So I started the MSW program January 2023, and I was discharged March of 2023.
Okay.
And so just 2 months shy of discharge from the military. That's when I started the MSW. Now, mind you, I was in the graduate program before then. I was trying to get a family and marriage therapy degree. And then halfway through, I decided to pull out because I just felt that the therapy realm was just too confined, too narrow,
Yeah.
and I waited until I found the actual degree program I wanted to to um, to experience.
Yeah. Well, when you went through your MSW, let me say a little something. I think one of the largest population of students that I've had that are non-traditional students come from the military, specifically when I was teaching in Hawaii, but even at University of Alaska Fairbanks as well. And it seems to me that a lot of folks that come into social work from the military are, they've maybe become disillusioned with something, or they realize they need some deeper meaning and they want to help or something like that. But I would say that it's always a privilege to have them in class because it kind of counterbalances the traditional student, if that makes sense. That is a little
Mm.
bit younger, without life experience, and folks in the military coming, whatever their background, they've got a load of life experience and professional experience and all of that, and so always able to contribute so much to the courses and the dialogue, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I definitely, in my program, there was quite a few of us. Um, Most of the veterans that were in my cohort in particular, um, they either went off to do work with the VA, they either did school social work, or they decided to do, um, social services related um, type work in nonprofit settings. But them being in class, yeah, I mean, I witnessed it. I saw how students responded to me, especially a lot of the advanced standing students.
Mhm.
They um, they always responded positively to my contributions and whatever I was presenting, whatever case study analysis that I was spearheading, whatever research that I was sharing for expanded knowledge and perspective. And so, yeah, definitely us being in the classroom is a is of major service because we bring that previous leadership experience. We operated in a career before this, and so
Mhm.
we're able to not only add to the content within the classroom and the discussion, but we're also, when we're doing those small groups as well, we're able to really help other students step into their leadership abilities. And I think that was something that I didn't see in the social work program was helping these students become leaders because essentially a social worker is is a leader. And then depending upon where you are, if you're not in an actual agency with a bunch of social workers that's very social work heavy, then you are going to be the one that's going to be providing the ethical guidance, the ethical insight. You're the ones that are going to be really navigating the helping and the change making process and all of that. So it's very important that you develop the leadership, the ability to speak up, the ability to be confident and courageous in whatever you are researching and you're writing and whatever modalities that you believe that is uh, very aligning whatever the context of the situation is. And so that was something that I know that I helped out with a lot, was just helping social work students find their voice and not allow other people to just dictate what they say, how they say, and when they say it.
Mhm. And one of the critiques I have on social work education, and I think there's some diversity depending on the program and who your professors are and all of that. But it's that we don't, it's not. a virtue of ours, or it's not an ultimate goal of ours, or even a requirement is for individuals to get to know themselves and to be able to self-apply things. And just like you said, I think if you asked me when I was at BSW some of the questions that you presented at the beginning and saying we should know about ourselves, I would have drawn a blank for the most part. I wouldn't have thought about it too much. Maybe I would have thought about it in really restricted, you know, through a really restricted lens. Um, but then you can go through a social work program and meet competencies and do all this and do all that and get your degree without really having to do that part of the work. I think many people do because you know, you're just presented with different opportunities to think and reflect, and you see yourself differently in the world. I know, for example, for me, when I took Sociology 101 and I started learning about income inequality and different things like that, I was like, whoa, I never knew it was quite like this, and so it made me, you know, do a double take and think I need to know more about this. But I feel like there should be just a much higher emphasis on that exploration of the self, so that when you graduate and you go on, you say, "I'm a professional social worker." You should also be able to answer if somebody asks you, "What are your values?" You know, what kind of lens are you seeing the world view that you're the world from? There's a lot of different
Yes.
terms I could use for that. But you know what I mean? We really
Yes.
don't broach that unless you had a specific, professor who was eccentric or looking at things outside of the box, you know what I mean? What do you think about that?
Agreed. I 100% agreed the with the reality that even though that some professors do bake in, and I know you do this, uh, self-reflection, use of self. I know a lot of social work students has probably heard that that methodology, use of self. A lot of that gets baked in. However, it's it's un- it's with the assumption that you already know yourself, and
Mhm,
and what it does is that as you are moving through the course content and you are becoming more familiar with different interventions and methods and strategies, therapeutic approaches, etc., is that you're able to, as you are moving along, you're able to sit with self and really figure out improvements, strengths, what it is that you need to apply more focus on, how you can go about making those changes, etc. But it's not at the depth of saying, okay, outside of the context of social work education, outside of the EPOS and the core competencies that we are to that we are using to measure your abilities and your skills, what are you bringing into the social workspace? I think that's the piece that we're missing. What are we bringing into it? Because I think when students start getting overwhelmed with the with the courses and they're doing research and evaluation, they're doing psychopathology, they start doing all these different, and then don't even and then internship, and if they're also working full time,
mhm.
and if they have children, and if they're caregiving, I mean, et cetera, it goes on of all the different obligations and responsibilities. It really starts to what becomes the primary focus is the course content. The course content. Discussion forums, the papers I got to do, presentations I got to give. Those are the type of things. And so I think that it really does need to have an actual dedicated course to self knowledge, self knowing, self discovery, and how that is the foundation and the basis to the leveling up of, okay, this is code of ethics. This is the history. These are the values. This is how social work champions self determination. I think that it should be a stair step approach that always starts with what your cultural context and your orientation to the life around you, nature, relationships, et cetera. And so I agree with you. I don't think it's enough. I think that It even when it's baked in, it's good, but it's not good enough because it's still getting overshadowed by all the different demands of the courses.
Yeah, you bring up several good points, and one of those is that when you do the math, especially if you're talking about MSW, advanced standing, but anywhere through, if you're taking a full time load, the math doesn't really add up for how much time you're supposed to spend per class in the classroom, outside of the classroom, how much reading you're supposed to do, like all the other things you mentioned, not to mention a job, an internship, got to pick up your kids, got to family time, somebody gets sick, you get sick, your kids get sick, and then you get sick, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't leave much time, between all those papers and everything else that you were talking about to for that self-reflection, for the profound, deep
Mhm.
self-reflection. We're busy from the moment we put our foot in the door of social work, from the moment we sign up for that, or apply that freshman year or whatever, to distinguish social work as a major. But I think another thing that I think maybe is worth talking with you, brother KD, is as I've learned about myself and culture and whatnot. If you'd asked me about culture, my culture, I don't know. I don't know exactly what answer I would have given you, but it might have been something like, "Oh yeah, I'm a fan of the New Orleans Saints, and I like this kind of music, and so and so. I watched the whatever TV show I was watching at the time, or something like that. These are my favorite movies." It would all be external things that we're maybe some of those I made a choice based on my individuality and preferences, but other things would be circumstantial and like where things that were just inherited or given to me, if that makes sense. Even if you were talking to people and they might
Yeah.
say, "Okay, well, I'm just making, I'm not picking on anybody in particular. I'm just saying like, oh, I'm Italian, or I'm Mexican, or I'm this Mexican American." And it's qualities or cultural qualities or cultural preferences that are kind of inherited to you. And I think what we don't realize is that, yeah, you can do and can inherit things, but you also can play an active role in the facilitation and the creation of the culture that you're a part of, right? I'm a
Mhm.
father right now. I see my kids every day. Obviously the way I behave is going to affect their cultural norms as they grow up, if you know what I'm saying. And so I think that
Yeah.
oftentimes we look at it as something that's only inherited instead of something that you can and do play an active role in developing and creating.
Mhm. Yeah. And to really build off of that, Professor Ace, culture is not monolithic. Even those of us who were born and socialized into a particular culture. Um, the thing about that is that it's ever changing and it's ever evolving. I like to remind people that when we're talking about culture, and this is also for the students too, is that culture transcends the expressions, all right? The dance, the music, the song, the food, the dress. It goes beyond that. A culture is very much ideological. It is very much spiritual. It is very much interpersonal, and it really lives in the body. That's why when, looking back at the enslavement of African people, that's how they were able to really create that cultural continuity, being from different ethnic groups and different tribes and speaking different languages. It's because they still held on to whatever their culture was in Yoruba, Nigeria, or their culture was in the Congo, and they just brought it. They brought it together, and they allowed it to interrelate and interconnect until and definitely throughout time and throughout um, the conditioning, it developed into it developed into jazz, and it developed into what they called pidgin English, and it developed into different styles of dance and being able to create drums out of different materials if they didn't have wood. And so you got to look at it like that. And so that's how I look at culture. is that because I've been severed from my ancestral past, I'm not going to practice culture the way that my ancestors did. And when living in the 21st century, in in this global society of this information age, yeah, it's going to you're going to have to there's going to be adaptations. But I will, what I, and so the main point of all this is that culture is in the mind. It's not specific to. I know we get a lot of, we get caught up into the expressions, the expressionisms of culture, and all of that is very vital to its survival and its existence. But it is very much the values of that culture. It's very much values, very much principles. It's very much what is the moral, ethical grounding for this particular culture, And so if you look more into the spiritual, the ideological frame, the way in which that people interact and interrelate with each other, with people outside of their culture, and also with nature and the universe, that right there gives you a better glimpse into the qualities, the characteristics, and also the the different orientations of what makes a person or makes a group of people distinct, special, and unique.
What role do you think language has to play in all that?
Oh man, language is the anchoring of any culture because that's the primary vehicle for socialization. And so the fact that I only speak English and I've been severed from my ancestral linguistic uh, connections with so I'm ancestrally from Equatorial Guinea. And so on my mother's side and on my father's side, I am ancestrally from Nigeria. And so we all know that with every African country, there is so many languages within that particular country.
Mm.
And so I have been I have been severed from that. So I speak only in English, and English is very limited when we're talking about deep structured thinking, thinking on the lines of philosophy and mythology and myths. And so I think what's important for me is that I pick up on Swahili in the African world. Swahili is the more common uh, African tongue. They consider it a Pan African um, African tongue, and so I try to use more terminology with that, especially when it comes to values, principles, and that. But it's very important because a lot of cultures speak in they use moral instruction, they use proverbs, they use they tell stories, the beginning of creation, different universal principles. All of that cannot be communicated holistically in English. And so, yeah, to really, get to the center of your question is that language is everything. Language is everything when it comes to a culture. We say love, right? And but in other cultures, it is more profound, it, it's deeper. It has more of a relational essence to it. And so I think sometimes that when we don't understand just how important language is, and we use our English to kind of to use it to interpret and make meaning, is that what happens is that it loses its potency and its deep structured meaning.
Yeah, and I think there's so much relevance all around the world. And what you're talking about is, here, well, I'm in Hawaii, but in Alaska, where many of our the folks tuning in are at. And by the way, you all are awful quiet in the chat. Get us some questions. Let us know what you're thinking. But
Yeah.
in Alaska, obviously, there a lot of people make the error of thinking that they hear the term Eskimo and they think there's, oh, well, there's one kind of or one group of native people in Alaska, but there's several different tribes, several major groups of people, and several smaller tribes, too many for me to name on here, all of different languages, and all of which had their language and culture suppressed at one time or another, and are trying to revitalize it. But that disruption is so powerful and hard to get back because it requires language. As somebody who's tried to learn other languages, it's really difficult as an adult to try to not see everything through an English lens. And in Hawaii, here in Hawaii, they had it was banned in the public school system until I think almost the 80s. So they literally weren't allowed and punished for speaking the Hawaiian language. And one of the errors we make, I think maybe we've all made this as a kid, but like this ethnocentric way of thinking that English is the main language and that anything can just be translated word for word. But we don't understand sometimes. I didn't understand until maybe I don't quite overstand completely, but um, I became aware of it not until in my 30s that a language would actually be an entire different lens and way of interpreting the world, if you know what I mean. And the last
Mhm.
thing I comment I wanted to make was it makes me think of Rastas, of Rastafarians. I think
Yeah.
a lot of us are familiar with reggae music and Bob Marley and all that, but if you look deep at Rastafari, it was really came about as a result to exactly what you're talking about, where they had been disrupted from and disconnected from language, culture, all of that, and so they viewed the English language as being oppressive and the British folks that were
Mhm.
ruling them as being oppressive. And so they essentially just created their own version of the English language, along with other,
Yeah.
things to do with culture. But instead of understanding, they overstand. They think the
Yeah.
word should sound like it means. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's so important all over the place. David says, now that you mention it, I can see how important language is to culture. My wife is Aleut, and their language is almost gone. Her and my daughter have been taking classes to try and revitalize it.
Yeah. It's that power of remembering. Language is when you know your native indigenous language, it is the connective fiber that attaches you across the spectrum of time and space to all those that came before you. And there's power in knowing. And again, you can't tell a story. Like, I'll give an example. Like in ancient Egypt, the story of Osiris and Heru, which was in Christianity, it was taken as God and Jesus and Mother Mary. Um, Now it's been translated, that story, and that was codified in hieroglyphs in ancient Egypt, thousands and thousands upon years ago, was in the local language, and it has been translated. However, there are aspects of the story. There's certain concepts of the story that is just so it's too deep for English, um, for English translation. And one concept is mayat. So mayat is a ethical framing: truth, justice, harmony, balance, reciprocity, etc. And so, even though that the literal term can be translated, the deep, profound meaning and how it relates to the relationship between nature, humanity, the universe, and how that must be in synchronization at all times. And if it's not, chaos emerges. And so that in particular, you don't get that from the English language. And even Egyptologists from Europe, when they did the translation of Maya, it was very superficial. They really couldn't give you anything beyond the cardinal virtues of justice, truth, and all those other ones that I named. And so, yeah, it's vital. Like language is vital. That's why it's important for us to, and if we can't speak the indigenous or your native language fluently, at least learn some concepts, at least learn a few words, at least learn how to say hello, welcome, goodbye, good night, whatever the case may be. Just some simple things to really break up the English monopoly.
Mhm. Yeah, and it even makes me, coming back here to Hawaii, the word aloha is often interpreted as meaning hi, but it's not. It's a,
Right.
some means something much deeper than that. That's used as a greeting. It can be used as hello or goodbye, or I guess it can be used as that, but it's used as a, a term of greeting or whatnot in different ways. But again, that English, that ethnocentrism, where we think that everything is literally translatable to what we use in our day to day lives, it's just,
Mhm.
inaccurate. We do got some more activity in the chat. David, just continuing on what he was saying earlier, like you were saying, Professor Ace, they were banned from speaking the language. I've heard many stories from my mother-in-law about her parents getting in trouble for speaking it. Yeah, and I mean, I mean, it's maybe a conversation for another day, but the level of the way that the language and the culture was severed from Alaska Native folks, along with other people around the world, was just really, it was worse than what you imagine it was, if that makes sense. The more and more I've looked into it with boarding schools and the methods that were used, I don't know what the intentions were of each and every person that partook in those things, and there is some diversity of
Mhm.
experience, but for the most part, the deeper you look, I mean, the worse that shit gets. It's unsettling to my mind to even think about it. That it's so recent in human history, and that we're still,
Yeah.
paying the price for all that. Um,
Cultural oppression. I mean, that's the when you look around the world, all the way from the indigenous people of Hawaii, the Aboriginals, and in Australia. When you look at the African continent, when you look at the when you look at the people of the Americas, Central, South, also the West Indies and the Caribbeans, you really start to see the convergence, the similarities and the commonalities of what happens when a a group of people with power, with control, and with authority decides to wants to systematically suppress and oppress and create and rupture that cultural continuity between the people and their ancestral land, their ancestral language, their ways of knowing, their ways of uh, teaching and learning and socializing, and even practicing spirituality. And so there's great similarities in all the different regions of the world where there are indigenous people, indigenous groups who are still feeling the impact from that cultural oppression.
mhm. Feeling it deeply, still going on to different degrees. We call it different things, and I don't know, we're more politically correct and for this modern day world. But for the most part, the damage is done, and we're still doing the damage. If you want to say like ecologically to the land, one of the things up here in
Absolutely.
Alaska, the uh, native folks in Alaska been hunting and fishing the land since the beginnings of the
Mhm.
day of the days, if you know what I mean. And there's places in Alaska now that where the native folks are banned from fishing the river because of the over commercialization of tourism and in this global world, everybody needs the salmon, the Pacific salmon, and so people get it in their refrigerator and or in the freezer in every Costco in America, if you know what I'm saying. And so they're
Yeah.
not able to do and participate in the cultural activities that have kept them sustained since long before anybody else was bothering around with it. Um, David
Same,
continues
same
to
thing
add,
as same thing has happened in Jamaica as well, where the privatization of beaches.
I've read about that.
Uh, yeah, fishermen are being pushed to the margins, being ostracized, really, and being alienated from their way of living and their livelihoods and their subsistence. And so, very, like I said, a lot of parallels and similarities with what has happened and what is still going on today. And it's our job as social workers to really open up expand our horizon, to look beyond what's going on in front of us, and really seeing just the systemic impacts and effects on marginalized and disenfranchised people. What
Mhm.
was David saying,
They just
Professor Ace?
contributed a little bit more, saying he never knew about any of it before he moved up here. They weren't taught about it, and the stuff that
Hmm.
the U.S. military did to the natives out here in the Aleutian chain during World War II is mind blowing. Um, it makes me think that that's a place where people can start too. There's a lot of different directions and a lot of places you can go, but start with the physical, the geographical location where you're at, and just look a little deeper into it. I grew up in Utah, and it's Utah named after Utes, and the University of Utah mascot football team, very popular football team, is named the Utes. And I know I don't remember any time even the Utes even being mentioned when I was growing up in school. Never knew one. Knew some as an adult, but never knew of any. Never heard talk of it. And then years later, I looked up. There was a history of the town that I lived in, like of the geographic area, and it mentions in the beginning that there were Utes and Shoshone that would that would come through there. They didn't. They were uh, they were always mobile, so they didn't stay in any one place, but they
Hmm.
had peaceful interactions, and the government came and told them that they had to leave. And so it's just interesting to think about where we've grown up and the things that have happened, and how does it go from that to where it's a where it goes from folks that live there, and then they're a mascot and the name of the state is named after them, but nobody even has a clue. I would guess if you went to a University of Utah football game, that most people would have no idea. If you know what I'm saying, they'd be a
Yeah.
fan of the team, but they'd have no idea. And to some degree, it's not even their own fault. It's the fault of how they came up and whatever. But we do have a responsibility. You know what I'm saying, to look a little deeper. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Especially like the origins of Thanksgiving, you know, and not and us not knowing, not us not knowing the role and the significance and of the Wampanoag people, of what's modern day new, what is it, like what is it, it's like where Massachusetts, New York, and all those northeastern states of the United States, um, that cluster, the Wampanoag people were already there. They already had their feet and their hands synced into the land. They already knew agriculture. They already had a very spiritual relationship with the universe, especially the sun. They were very helpful people, very hospitable people, very relational, and they were taken advantage of. And and here we are in most part of the world, you know, eating really good and yeah, you know, eating really good around the table, and we don't really understand the roots and the actual origins of um, this holiday that gets so much that the Wampanoag people, we don't even say their name. We talk about the Pilgrims.
Mhm.
We don't even say the Wampanoag people's name. We don't, because we don't even know that they are a part of the historical context that has created the historical context of this. I'm speaking within North America, the historical context of the shaping of North America, and for the most part, they were treated horrifically and treated with so much disdain and contempt after showing them how to harvest corn, amongst other things. They actually trained the pilgrims. They actually showed them the ways of the land, and they still were destroyed and dominated. And so I definitely understand the way that when you're talking about the indigenous people of Utah. It's like, yes, and that's just I'm just I didn't even, that's just one area,
Mhm,
one specific, that's a particular that's very specific context, but that's all over. That's all over,
mhm.
you
And
know?
when we look into the history, it's hard too because there's so much of it that happened that you could be looking at a people, but they've already been moved 5 times, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
the way looking at it history, I think that the only way for us to have accepted it the way we have as Americans, and I just mean collectively, like being able to celebrate Thanksgiving without talking about any of it, you know what I'm saying, is that the erasure of it because it's so bad in so many ways that the only way is to pretty much I mean, I know that it's there a little bit in school and all that, but for the most part, it's been erased from
Yeah.
our history, from our modern consciousness. It's, even the, previous generation, they would have watched cowboy and Indian movies and stuff like that and had some different kind of exposure, but I think that the modern world, they don't even there's not even that, if you know what I'm saying. It's just completely
I do.
erased. Um, let's get to some of these
Absolutely.
questions in the chat, that are
Okay.
building up here. Christine says, um, she was driving to pick her kids up from school. Sorry, no worries, Christine. I love that
Yeah,
you
be
use
safe.
I love that you use the word severed. This word really paints a picture of how you feel when it comes to your ancestry. Oh, this does that.
Yeah.
Hold on. When it comes to your ancestry, how do you honor or try to reconnect with your culture if you feel cut off? Language is important. How
Yeah.
can you connect to it? Through music?
Yeah. I would definitely say that if you have no connection to your ancestry, you have no ability to trace your family genealogy. I'll take it from there. If I would say first start off with elders. If you have elders in your family, try to obtain from them their earliest memory, their earliest memory of socialization, the ways of knowing, the ways of learning, the ways of exchanging. Let's say you don't have that, right? I would then say, is now at this point, if you have nothing around you, no one around you to be able to point you into a direction, I will then say is if you do know your ethnicity, to start there. Learn the philosophies that kind of fed that that are ethnically affirming and ethnically centered. Let's say you don't know that. I would then say is to find sources that that champion and center the voices of indigenous people, whether that be African, whether that be Samoan, whether that be, the aboriginals. It doesn't matter. Just find it. Find the different philosophies that provide the basis for human beingness and human nature. Okay, so that's kind of where now for me, I know that I was an African American. And so I knew that my grandparents were from the South. And I knew that my grandparents, who came after slavery, were a part of the sharecropping. And sharecropping was the extension of slave labor after African people were freed. And so I started just to look at just the general African philosophies, the general African religious systems, and the ways of spiritually orienting themselves to the universe. And then from that, I started to find the particular pathways and the particular nuances that were of interest to me. And then that's where it's important. That's why I'd say earlier that culture is not monolithic. You can be innovative And if you don't have something, if you weren't inherit, if you didn't inherit anything, you can create something that is sustainable and that can help you progress and transform and evolve to your best, to the best version of yourself.
You know, that's probably one of the number one questions that come up when we're talking in, social work classes about some of these deeper issues is, where do I start if I don't have anything to go off of? And so I appreciate that answer. And that shows up in my relationship with my wife. I can go on and a lot of my family has ties to the Mormons historically. And so I can go on and find treasure troves of information. Whereas, she has to look in a different way. Like,
Hmm.
she has to take a different route than I do. I still think that we can get to the same place, if you know what I'm saying. Um,
Yes.
but different
Yes.
route. And so I think a lot of folks feel that way to varying degrees. Um,
Yeah.
we have some more stuff here in the chat. Let's see.
Okay.
Um, yeah, Monica added that I agree that a lot is lost in translation and gives way to misinterpretation, miscommunication, and ultimately lost connection. There still can be a lot communicated through body language, sincerity, kindness, empathy, etc. I also agree meeting
Mhm.
each other halfway through education can expand connection quite a bit. I feel like we're getting pushed to a head with oppression to where we are going to be organically grouped together and able to relate to each other in that capacity. Jesse
Mhm.
adds, we are always presented our history in the United States from the perspective of power. We will never be taught the
Yeah.
real truth, or it was glossed over. I never learned a lot of this until college. Something I would like to add to that, and you can add to it too if you want, brother KD, is that
Yeah.
I've been studying in depth the FBI and the CIA over the last couple of years. It's really hard because it's really dry stuff and it's really hard to go through it all. But one of the things, I guess I shouldn't say I've been surprised, but I mean, I'm surprised about the level of dishonesty and all sorts of under the table stuff that has went on historically with the FBI and the CIA, kind of like a monster that got away from itself and is unable to control itself anymore. Frankenstein, if you might say, for both of them.
Hmm.
And they don't ever release any of the important information because it would sever our all of our trust in the citizens' trust of the United States of America if you knew the things that groups like the CIA and the FBI and others have been doing and are doing. And so they don't release that information, if they ever do, until several decades later when most of the emotional connection and all that stuff is long since passed. So it's very deliberate that we don't know about certain
Yeah.
things or how or why certain things were done. Um, and they lie their asses off like constantly. And so anything I ever hear from the FBI or the CIA after learning about the history, I mean, it's still called, J. Edgar Hoover headquarters. And so
Yeah.
I don't believe any literally anything that they say. I don't believe any of it at this point. CIA, FBI, stuff like that. I think it's complete fabrication, and we'll find that out later, but just a little too late.
Yeah. We definitely, that I think we have a very um we have a very we have a very important role in societies because not only are we supposed to be honest brokers, but we're also supposed to be truth tellers. And and I brought this up to you, Professor Ace, and obviously you've been teaching for over 10 years. Is you know in the mission of social work, it lays out plain who are the people, the groups of people that we are supposed to provide our care, attention, skills, knowledge, competencies, abilities, all of that too. And that's oppressed people. So we must become we must overstand the historical to the contemporary context of oppression and how, and not only its origins, but also the way in which that it gets perpetuated and the way in which that it becomes uh, adapted by so many different people in different kind of ways in order to cope with reality. And so, going back to what you're talking about, you know, we have to look at. that the fact that United States, Europe, all these other different places, their the way that they came into existence were on the backs of black, brown, indigenous, African people. So that means that the institutions that come thereafter, legal, legal and education, and eventually law enforcement, criminal and justice system, all of those things that were created thereafter, those perpetuated the ideology of superiority and power over. So we have to, yeah, we can't just look at, because we're in the now time, and not everything is black and white now. Everything is not explicit, and so you have to read through the fine lines. You have to see who is drastically impacted by these practices, policies, and you'll see, okay, the ideology is being perpetuated. The ideology is ongoing. The ideology is still living and breathing. And that's where we come in. We're supposed to look at that. We're supposed to look at that all the time. And so, yeah, to your point, the Coin Intel Pro and CIA uh, illegal supervision and planting of informants to disrupt liberation movements. It was to ensure that one of the number one powers of any oppressed people is unity. And if you
Mhm.
break that down, now you have now they're at a disadvantage, and you can use that to manipulate, control, and exploit.
Mhm. Yeah, and for those of you that are listening, and if any of this is new to you, I highly encourage you to search COINTELPRO. We often use Martin Luther King Jr. as a beacon here in the United States. We got a holiday named after him, and I think when most folks look at civil rights and stuff, they're gonna MLK Jr. is gonna pop to the top of the list. But if you look at how the FBI and the CIA viewed him at the time and how they treated him, they were sending him letters telling him to kill himself and things like that, and to confuse him and things like that. If you look at Fred Hampton, Chicago Black
Mhm.
Panthers back in the day, murdered by the FBI. Um, you look at why, and I think you mentioned it. Unity. He was collaborating at the moment with Latinos through the Young Lords,
Yeah.
collaborating with white groups, the Weather Underground,
Mhm.
different ones. But he had a thing called the Rainbow Coalition, and he was so good and adept at saying what he needed to say, and with on an oratory level to get people. I mean, just go watch a few of his talks when he's only 21 years old. But it's no coincidence
Mhm.
that he was searching for that or collaborating with that sense of unity, the Rainbow Coalition, when he was killed. You look at Malcolm X. He had just turned towards a more unifying perspective. Dead. The list can go on, but um, I think that we would be much better prepared as citizens and as human beings, as social workers, even if we learned the real. I guess there's never a completely real history, but a full, well-rounded history, and we just didn't know about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, but we knew everything else as well.
Yeah.
It would help us to be more skeptical of believing, anything and everything that comes across in today's world. 'Cause it's confusing times, right?
Absolutely.
For what not too long ago, it was just print and maybe on TV that folks started to believe things in such a way. But now the internet is so massive, and you could have a meme on Facebook that could carry a lot of weight that has no grounding in reality, if you know what I'm saying. So we're in weird times.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um, we have Jesse says, "What are your suggestions for someone who comes from a few different backgrounds? How does one decide what to gravitate to?"
That's subjective. I would say that whatever y- w- whatever you lean more towards too. I can't I can't influence that choice, and I don't want to take away your self-determining power. Um, if it's I would say look more on in the lines of matrilineal, so through your mother, or patrilineal through your father. So, whichever one within your life context that you've always felt more connected, that you gravitated to the most, I would say go that route. For me, it was matrilineal. And so that's how I learned about um, coming from Equatorial Guinea, how my people fled to the Bioko Islands, how the Portuguese colonized the Bioko Islands, and then it they were also they used that as a a port for the Middle Passage as well. And so it was, and that's like I said, it's subjective. I was just more connected to my mother's side, and so I will bring that back to you with whatever side matrilineal, patrilineal, uh, go that go whichever direction your heart is more compelled to for your full direction, attention, and concentration.
Mhm. And I can agree with that in my own experience as somebody who also, if you look, it goes in a lot of different directions, a lot of different ways for a lot of different reasons. Um, and when I've looked into it, it's almost felt like I've been called to certain parts on the tree, you might say, or whatnot. And the same thing for me, Jesse. Like I felt like I was starting with nothing. Like I knew where last names came from a little bit, but I really had no context, no stories were passed down, no direct information about anywhere else besides Utah. And I just started looking, and I'd find little tidbits here, and like again with a lot of help from the Mormons because they keep such good records. Uh, but I think that it's interesting that the part of the family that I feel called to most is through my father's mother's side, and it may be because they have a lot of information on them and they kept diaries and wrote letters to each other and whatnot. But it's interesting that they're the one family that's not connected to the Mormons that I was able to gravitate to despite all the other information. And I think it was just from a process of self reflection and looking and seeing where I was called. There's again another a variety of paths or parts of the tree that I could have went down, and that's still there for me to explore. But just keep looking and searching inward, and
Mhm.
sometimes you're gonna have to put together the pieces of the puzzle. And I wish you the best, Jesse, in finding what it is that you need and what you're looking for. And I look forward to continuing to get to know you and seeing how that turns out. I missed a question from Monica on accident. She asked, "What are your thoughts on the possibility of globally coming together to collectively advocate and up level ourselves for ourselves, like a United Nations for people, a grassroots UN?"
Oh, you were breaking up, Professor Ace. I could barely
Oh.
hear you. You were coming in choppy.
She asked, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
I can't hear you at all.
How about you in the audience? Can you all hear me? We cutting out.
Yeah. It's coming in very delayed and very choppy.
Okay, I'll try it again. Um, Monica asks, "What are your thoughts on the possibility of globally coming together to collectively advocate and up level for ourselves, like a United Nations for the people?" No.
Yeah. I know that you're speaking. I can't make it out on what exactly you're saying. What are your thoughts on the possibility of globally coming together to collectively advocate and up level for ourselves? And it said like a United Nations. Is that what I got? Like yeah, like a United Nations for people, the grassroots UN. I would definitely say um, power must be accumulated locally, and there must be uh, transcontinental uh, connections made. And then so I think before we even get to the point to where we're going to a UN, is that Uh, we need to develop localized, organized, um, kind of power hubs, political, economic, social, spiritual. And then we can create those connections to the ancestral land. For us here in North America and South America, Central America as well, we need to, taking that model of localizing the political, economic, social power, is that we create the connections to the Pan African connection to Africa, and using that to also develop those relationships with governance, with the politics of that particular country, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's Ghana. Um, you know, there's 54 countries, and so but you definitely need to have, you definitely need to create a transcontinental connection hub, power source, and then that's when I believe that it's best to then go forward to the UN. Um, I I think that for us who've been historically disenfranchised, marginalized, and oppressed, is that there needs to be there needs to be a lot of healing work that needs to be done. Then there needs to be a lot of empowerment that needs to happen, and the realizing of strengths, the sharing of ideologies, the sharing of the conceptions of humanity and nature and reality. And so I think a lot of that can be done through 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 different localized ways of creating, maintaining, sustaining social power. And then once you get to that point where there is a collective shared consciousness, and the aim and the objectives are clear and the purposes are clear and all of that, then I then I believe at that point. Not saying that any other established organization can't do that, but if we're saying we're working from the foundation that we're not organized, that's how I believe that one of the ways to do it. Again, there's organizations that are in existence now that actually have the the mass numbers and the strength in numbers and the unity to do so. Um, Now, a question on why they're not doing it, that's for another conversation. But if we're talking about creating something out of nothing, it has to start with amassing social power, and you have to do that locally, and then starting to broaden it out.
Yeah, thank you, KD, and thanks for everybody in the audience checking in and letting us know. Can you hear me yet?
Can't hear you, brother.
You still can't hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You're quiet now.
Yeah. Anything on your end that you might be able to tinker with? The audience is saying they can hear us.
Your lips are moving, Professor Ace, but I hear nothing coming from your mouth.
All right, here we go.
I don't know what's happening.
Just a second here. So tell us about liberation social work. Just a second, I'm popping it in the chat for everybody.
Still can't tell us about liberation social work. Yeah, so liberation social work um, is something that I've conceived of while I was going through the MSW program. I learned that the different ways in which social work is expressed and practiced, I always felt that it did not fully account for the indigenous and African philosophical origins. And so, I was already going into world history and learning African spirituality, all those things that I named earlier. And thank you for putting the website on there. And I looked at liberation psychology. I looked at that. I looked at liberation theology. I looked at Black liberation movements. I also looked at the liberation movements on the continent. I also looked at the different, I looked at slave revolts. Anything that really, push the thrust for wanting to be free, wanting to express yourself separately and with the self-determination outside of the oppressive system. I looked at it. And so liberation social work, to be concise, is a value-based, principle-driven, Afrocentric approach to human and community well-being through the pursuit of self-knowledge, self and collective healing, and the expansion of social, cultural, and critical consciousness. And so it's an approach. It's something that can be fully adapted. It's something that can resonate with if you're practicing a in a therapeutic setting and your agency is telling you that you have to do CBT and motivational interviewing, what have you. Again, because it's value based and principle driven, there's no mandates, right, to how that is realized and expressed. And so that's now that I've graduated, I fully invested in the research um, and the practice and the servicing um, of liberation social work in spaces like these. I also do some group work, and I always bring concepts, ideas, and of liberation social work wherever I go, because I do believe um, that the current way of doing social work is not that expansive and um, does not consider different worldviews. And because of that, I decided that to use my African origins, my African past, my African ancestors to guide the work of liberation social work. And so none of this is something that I'm just cooking up with. I'm cooking up just for the sake I'm doing it. Is actually I'm using a lot of historical analysis, a lot of deep structured thought. I'm taking those different symbols and ways of how African people have expressed morality and ethics, and I'm using that to really help define and structure and lay out the basis for liberation social work.
Yeah, appreciate you,
Oh yeah, yeah.
brother KD,
So
and
that's the website. It's fully up and running. You get up on it, and you'll see the pillars. You'll see some of the ideas and ideas and principles and concepts. And then pretty soon, I'm going to have a list of values and principles listed on there with an actual assertion that goes with each one. And so then it'll be a good foundation that if you want to say, hey, I want to do revolutionary social work and I want to do uh, liberation social work on top of whatever else you want to layer that with, then stay tuned for that. I'm still building that out.
yeah, right on. I think brother KD still can't hear me, so we're going through the chat. I'm asking him, how can people learn more about liberation social work and connect on a deeper level?
Yeah. As far as how people can learn more about liberation social work, I mean, other than if you want to have direct conversations with me, I'm fully open, willing, and ready to do that. But if you want to do something as far as on a self development level, um, obviously go to the website. And if that is not enough, I would say that if is to really, I gave the resource for Afrocentric paradigm, is to also look at that, and if that is not enough, um, I would say start looking into the other different liberation based disciplines like liberation psychology. Liberation psychology, even though I will contest that liberation psychology goes before Central and South America, but in the scholarship, it is, I believe his name was Ignacio Martin. I think he was he's responsible for actually coining the term liberation psychology. So I would say start there. Um, and definitely, yeah, you don't start there, and if that's not enough, I would say philosophy look at ancient traditional philosophy, look at the philosophies of the Olmecs, look at the philosophy of the Toltecs, look at philosophy, because what philosophy does, it really it gives you insight into how people conceived of life and the universe and reality outside of oppressive conditions. And I think that's vital for us to know that. What is it supposed to look like for human nature within this vast ecosystem, within this vast universe, outside of all the different oppressive forces? And so if you start looking at, if you gotta, philosophy can be a little dry. it can it can be a little dry, but it would definitely give you insight into a way that people really try to develop their culture, their sense of knowing, their sense of relating, outside of any type of infringing upon their self-determination. Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor, for putting the liberation social work in there. And also, yeah, Creativist is another platform too. Creativist is another platform. There's a newsletter called Liberation Social Work, and so I go in there and I speak on different subject areas, um, from an Afrocentric perspective. And one of the last pieces that I did was looking at clinical social work, psychopathology, and really breaking that down and really shedding a new light on alternative ways of conceiving, of practicing, intervening, etc., in relationship to those who are experiencing, people who are experiencing mental, emotional, and behavioral challenges.
Thank you, brother KD. I'm still going here on the chat thing. Thank you,
Pleasure's
brother.
all mine. Thank you so much, Professor Ace. Thank you all, students, for having me. And I really hope that from this conversation that you all are able to fly high and soar and expand your perspective, scope, and lens. Thank you.
Peace, brother KD.